around, we'll get started. Esther, book of Esther, chapter 2, verse 1 is where we're picking up for our study today. And we've had a couple of good weeks of discussion.
Brad's missed it, so.
Yeah, well, it should be on tape.
Just ask Debbie, she's got all that.
Yeah, so.
I'm kind of glad I was here last week.
Brad, you know I've arranged for Dale to be racing. He's not here. He'll be back.
Oh, I heard the baby, the husband, so I think I can thank you.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, if you go to YouTube, and type in Olivet Worship as one word, it'll carry you to our website, and you can see Matt's sermons, as well as our previous classes, and we've had a couple really nice discussions. And I have no doubt that that will continue as we go through the book. I'm fairly confident of that, as a matter of fact, that we will have some more of those good discussions. But picking up in chapter 2, verse 1, New International Version, reading, "Later, when the anger of King Xerxes had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done, and what he had decreed about her." Now, it's often thought in simple reading that maybe only a short period of time had passed from the removal of Vashti to the events of this chapter, chapter 2. The later that you read in verse 1 is clarified in verse 16 of this same chapter. Because there in 16, it's speaking of Esther when she was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. So this would have been 4 years after the events of chapter 1. And in the intervening time, Xerxes' invasion of the Greek city-states had taken place. And after some initial victories, we've all heard of the 300 at Thermopylae. He was the king leading the Persian forces against this, and they burned Athens. And then they were defeated in the sea battle at Salamis, right in that same time. So Xerxes came back from that initially triumphant invasion, a defeated king. And it's interesting that it might be wondered, what was remembered. It says in the verse that he remembered what Vashti had done. And, it's just interesting because there's never any clarification as to what he was remembering. Remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. We would like to think that maybe there was a little bit of remorse in him after realizing that this queen that was so obviously so beautiful, he had deposed because she refused a stupid request on his part. But any remorse that he may have had was thwarted by the law, by his law, which by custom could not be changed. So after he had reacted as he had to Vashti and had deposed her, and she'd been put out and put away as being queen, he couldn't just simply change his mind and undo it. So whatever he remembered was bound in by the law that he had issued. So verse 2 picking up, then the king's personal attendants proposed, "Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful girls into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women. And let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." And this advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. So, as the king remembered, evidently he shared that memory with his advisors, and they suggested that a new queen be sought for the king.
You know how men will talk, so, and I think the reason that what he remembered was what she had done. She didn't listen to him and disobeyed him. I think that's what he remembered.
Yeah, and it could very well be. We would like to think there was some remorse, but probably not. He wasn't that kind of man.
I figured he'd say, hey, get
Yeah.
out there, I don't want another
Yeah,
queen.
I need somebody to take her place.
Fair
you know?
maidens in here, and let me look
Yeah,
at it.
she embarrassed me in front of my nobles, even though he should have been embarrassed. And I've gotten rid of her, so now I need somebody that I can parade and show that she's taken Vashti's place. And the suggestion was, well, let's have a beauty contest throughout the kingdom. And we'll, through the 127 provinces of the empire stretching from what is today Pakistan to Sudan, that girls would be brought, and then a new queen would be chosen from these. And it's at this point in chapter 2 that we begin to get the first indication as to why all of this introductory material, all of chapter 1, was given. And that is to begin to show the hand of God in the ordinary events of life that will ultimately lead to the protection of His people in the future. Now, we've talked a lot in this class about providence, especially in the book of Ruth. We talked a lot about it in the book of Ruth. And there in the book of Ruth, we talked about people stepping up to step into the flow of God's workings. And we talked about it with Ruth when she went out and by chance went into a field, Boaz, all this. We talked about, stepping up to step into God's flow. But in the book of Esther, beginning especially as indicated in the second chapter, we have another aspect of God's providential working, which is that which works in the background, that is not seen. It is the working through events and people that at the time seemingly have nothing to do with God. God is using that and using them to create situations in which God's people can be delivered. Chapter 1 really is basically a repeat or retelling of history. Nothing really spiritual about chapter 1 as far as chapter 1 goes in the events. And it's almost like, well, why did the writer include all this material? As we move into chapter 2 and a new queen is sought, we begin to understand that all this is just simply background material. And it's in these ordinary events that God is working. And this is all because of God's foreknowledge. God knows what we will do, and thereby He is able to work His plans through all those events. So, whenever we encounter an opportunity to do something for God, it's because He has worked through those many situations, most of them ordinary. Most of them, would just slip right by our attention in order to bring both you and me and that opportunity together. Questions on that? Comments? Have you had times in which an opportunity presented itself, and it was only after that opportunity you were able to look back and look at all the little steps that were involved in bringing you and that opportunity together?
Well, I know that for me, in 2009, when I realized that my daughter and son-in-law were on drugs, and in 2010 they were arrested, I look at my life and how God changed it in 2007 because I wasn't following Him for a long period of time as I knew that I should have been. And I see how as He changed, as He brought about a change in my heart in 2007 to realize how much where I was not where I needed to be and where I needed to be following Him more, I could have never handled their situation the way I did. It could have done that in 2007.
So, in using that example, from 2007 to 2010, that's a zero, you got 3 years. So 3 years the Lord was preparing for an event, a situation, a circumstance that you probably had no idea was happening in 2007. But the Lord knew, because he sees the end from the beginning and is able to work through bringing all the incidents, all of the things that you needed to bring you into a greater relationship with him. And this began to prepare you for what you still had no idea, but God did. And it's just interesting to think about this, and we'll see it again and again. This is one of the great lessons, I think, out of the book of Esther, is that God uses so many natural, ordinary events and situations of life that just pass right by us, but they're all ingredients in his working through things to bring you and it to a point. Maybe you're starting back here. He sees this point, and he's working all through all these things, that when you get to this point, you and an opportunity have met, and you're able to cross paths, and you can do and be something for God. And that's one of the things that really stands out to me as we look at this book of Esther, because once again, the book of Esther is the only book of Scripture God is never mentioned. Not a single time is he ever mentioned in the book. And where is it? He's working through those things that we, in our daily living, doesn't mean we're not spiritual or anything, but he works through so many minute, ordinary events of life to bring us and an opportunity together into one place. And we're finally introduced to the two main characters of the book, beginning in verse 5. Now there was, in the citadel of Susa, a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, named Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah, or Jeconiah, depends on which translation you may have, both of them the same. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This girl, who was also known as Esther, was lovely in form and features, and Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many girls were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Hegai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Hegai, who had charge of the harem. The girl pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 maids selected from the king's palace and moved her and her maids into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Here finally, into the 2nd chapter, we're introduced to the two main people of the book, and Mordecai and Esther. Esther means star, and that was her Persian name. Her Hebrew name, as is mentioned here, was Hadassah, which means myrtle. And now Mordecai was the great-grandson of the man listed as Kish here, who had been taken captive. Sometimes in reading this, some people have said, well, it reads like Mordecai was taken captive. If so, he would have had to have been at least 120 years old by the time these events taken place. But really what it was is that Kish was the one who had been taken into captivity. His family genealogy, his posterity had grown up, and now his great-grandson was Mordecai, and he was living, in Susa. And this was also the same time that Kish came into captivity. It was the same time that other folks, Ezekiel was taken into captivity at the same time, Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 1. So Kish, as well as Ezekiel, had been taken into captivity. And he's also referred to in this chapter as a Jew. which comes from the word Judah, of course, and that was used in the time of the exile to refer to an Israelite. Israel was gone. The 10 northern tribes had been taken in captivity by the Assyrians, and then the last 2 tribes had been taken into captivity by Babylon. So Israel was no more. From here on, they're called Jews. Israelite really is not a term that is used for these people from here on out. And it's interesting that some commentators will say that Mordecai, just giving you some background of all of what's happening here, that Mordecai also was a eunuch. Because, one, he has no family mentioned, and he had access to the women's quarters. In that day especially, you didn't come close to the harem if you were a fully male, putting it in nice terms. But if you were an eunuch, the king had no danger of you spoiling his women. So for him to be able to walk back and forth outside of the women's courtyard, to be close enough, he evidently was a eunuch and was a part of the palace even at that point. And it's just interesting. I had never really thought about that a lot until preparing the lessons. And this may give us a little idea as to why Mordecai was still in Persia. Because the Jews had been allowed by Cyrus to be able to go back to Jerusalem 50 years ago, or more. Almost 100 years ago. And Mordecai is still living there. But if he was a eunuch, Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 1, Moses' law says that if you have a problem as a male, and your stones have been removed, that's the reading of the passage, you could not enter into the temple. You can enter into the tabernacle. You were because you were not perfect. Once again, not that there was anything sinful about it. It was simply promoting the fact that before God you had to be holy, which happened in and through Jesus Christ, the blood of his sacrifice. But that could also have been a reason why his family stayed on in Persia. We don't know for sure, but it's quite a possibility. So we have the entrance of Mordecai and Esther almost as an afterthought. And it's once again just ordinary people living within the empire of Persia. And commentators will note that in the historical records of the time, there's mention made of an accountant within the government of Persia by the name of Mardukah, which could easily have been a foreign name for Mordecai. So he may have already been an accountant in the government of Xerxes. And if that's so, Mordecai was placed providentially into a situation that later would be very influential for the Jewish people. And we'll talk about this again and again as we move on into the book. But it should be noted here that God may have opened a door in the business world to accomplish something in the spiritual world. And in bringing all this out, once again, what I want to emphasize is the fact that God uses us in ordinary situations. Uses ordinary situations and us to accomplish his will. Now, oftentimes, we may think as an individual, because I don't have a spiritual calling. I don't sing, I don't teach, I don't preach, I don't this, I don't that. I'm really not much of anything for the Lord. But here we have a person who may have been an accountant. Just living, just making his way, but providentially was being placed so that he could have a huge influence on what would happen not only to his family, as far as Esther is concerned, but for the whole nation of the Jews throughout the empire. And along with this, he had become guardian of Esther, who was his cousin. And Esther, the passage says, was lovely in form and features. Again, something ordinary that was providentially given to her through family traits and genetics that would become an ingredient in the larger providence for the Jews. And it's again interesting that God can use genetic and familial traits as instruments of His will. When we think of being useful to the Lord, really consider that every part of you, every part that makes you you, is a possible instrument of God. What do you think about that? Comments, questions, validations, objections, etc., and so forth.
You got to be willing. You got to be willing to be that instrument.
You have to be willing to be that instrument and recognize everything I am is a possible instrument for God to use. What is your personality? Are you easy to meet, easy to talk to, easy to get along with? That could be an instrument to be able to just, weave right in a witness for Jesus Christ. You're being an instrument for the Lord. Are you a visionary? Are you able to think outside the box? Are you able to, look beyond what is happening and see possibilities? That could become an instrument of helping someone in a dire situation to realize that through Jesus Christ, things can be different. Everything about us. This is the great thing about Esther. She was beautiful in form and appearance. So what? Well, in this case, it helped her to be queen, who was able to save the Jewish nation. So her good looks did help her, But it was a genetic trait, just ordinary stuff, that God was able to utilize. So everything about us, everything about you, is a useful tool. You don't have to be anything special to be an instrument for God. Just let Him work through. Be willing to allow Him to work through, whatever is there. To me, it's just really interesting as we look at this book and see these ordinary things that became pieces for God. And Esther was caught up. Verses 8 through 11, she was caught up in the fulfillment of the king's edict. We would like to think, that once Esther had been discovered, she was courted and everything and wooed and brought to the citadel. But really, she was just part of the dragnet that went out over the empire, and just another one of the girls of the groups from these 127 provinces that were brought to the king, and to be viewed by him, and then to become just another item in his collection of women. Numbers vary according to the commentator you may read, but there could easily have been hundreds of girls brought to Susa, and as a result of this, suffered virtual restricted widowhood. That's what one commentator phrased it as. Because once they had spent the night with the king, they were put in the harem, and unless he called for them, that's where they stayed for the rest of their life. They didn't leave. So they became, even as young teenage girls, virtual widows. And commentators note that the word brought, and King James Version will say gathered, in this section of Scripture. Many girls were brought, verse 8. That word has more of the sense of taken by force. In other words, this beauty contest was not optional for the women throughout the empire. So once again, good old Xerxes is not a remorseful man. I want me a good-looking woman, and I want her brought here to the kingdom, and I want her to be a part of my harem and be made queen. Now you go get these girls, that whether they want to come or not is really quite irrelevant. So, here's a question. Out of all of that, and for you new folks, if you can't read it, don't worry, no one else has in 5 years. Why didn't Mordecai hide Esther?
Well, that's what, how is?
You've been waiting for this, ain't you? I can tell, I can look at your face, you were just waiting.
No, but you know what, it's far, but how is Mordecai different from Naomi? I think that what he is doing is, we threw her under the bus, and so why is Mordecai's doing the exact same thing? Is he not?
He's a businessman.
See, that's why it's
Probably a bonus
okay. That
if he
is
gets
truly,
big.
I'm thinking, why are we thinking Mordecai? Because is there any difference truly? If anything, what he's doing is worse as far as that scheme work, because he's sending her into the king's harem. So
Now, there's a bonus here. If she is picked, and comes out of his crowd, he's like a sports agent. He's going to get a big bonus. You got to see what's going on with that.
and I'm just, but I'm just,
Well, you know what I'm saying about bonus and all them people pick this weekend, you know, the guy.
I'm just curious. How is this different?
Well, I don't think he wanted to disappoint the king either, because, if you disappoint the king, there could be consequences that you may not like. Might disappear,
Maybe he felt it was God's will.
end up with bashing in the dungeon somewhere.
And if there are Jews in this country, I mean, they're probably thinking about their life or death.
And, just like Brad said, in a way, there's certain quirks that you're gonna get that other people wouldn't, and, so make life easier on them.
Still boils down to self.
There you go.
So in thinking about this, and you bring up good points, and I think the analogy between Mordecai and Naomi is good. What is the difference? Naomi schemed. She sent Esther. Remember chapter 3 of Ruth. She told Ruth to go down to the threshing floor and dress up. In other words, put the makeup on, look almost like a harlot, and uncover the man's feet and lay down, and then he'll tell you what to do after you scare him half to death. And so, what's the difference between there and Mordecai? Now, it's possible that she was already known. If he was already in the citadel, his family was already known. She could have already been recognized as a beautiful little girl. So, for him to have hidden her really would not have been an option, simply because she may have already been known. Because he was a part of the government. If he was an accountant, whatever he was, he had access at least to the outside of the women's quarters, so he could have communication back and forth. So he had to have some position, and it could be that she was already known, so hiding her was not an option. Also, and I think this is interesting, we'll see this come up, there was a lot of anti-Semitic feeling in the government at that time. Xerxes is the one who was recorded in Ezra as putting a stop to the building of the city of Jerusalem. Because when he came to power, there were revolts in Babylon and in Egypt. The last thing he needed was another group, and that being the Jews, between him and Egypt. So there was some anti-Semitic, this is what we would term it today. They just didn't like Jews. I don't think we can negate the fact that perhaps he thought there might be some perks. If she's chosen, it's possible that she might be able to impact the government's ill will toward the Jews. And this was an end to the government for him to gain power. If he was already in, some of that self, whoever mentioned that out there, some of that self could very well have been there. And if she was already known, he had no choice. For him to have tried to get away would have probably simply resulted in his and her deaths. Because Xerxes is not a forgiving man, as we have found out. Not yet, anyway. Yeah. So, I think, at least these, and maybe there are some other ideas that you may have of why didn't he hide Esther? And, in looking at the difference, probably not a whole lot between the two of them, Naomi and Mordecai. Was his more honorable? I don't know that we can make that distinction. Don't know that we can say that. What do you think?
I don't like that. I think absolutely not, because she was doing it to survive.
Mm-hmm.
He's doing it. He's not struggling, no matter what. In the Bible, we take it, and it's true. He's not struggling. He has a position. And back then, although he was Jewish, even then it was known that wasn't it that they were better. That's who did the accounting work and the math work and in their room. So while they might not have liked Jewish people, that's who did the work and kept the money because of their religious rules. They were trustworthy, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So see, to me, she was absolutely more understandable why she did it, as much as I don't like what she did than he was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's why I say I don't know that we could make a distinction between the two as far as the honorableness. Indeed, she was struggling. It was to her more of a situation of eat or not eat. Whereas Mordecai seemed to be doing okay. He was already possibly an accountant in the government. He had a position. It wasn't like he was on the verge of starvation. And so unless we really emphasize, this part right here, that he saw this as God's will, and we don't know that because it's not stated in here, at least at this point. Possibly he felt and was an insightful person. He was a smart man, no doubt about that, being an accountant in government at that time, having a position. So he had to have some pretty good, wits about him. Perhaps he was able to see this as a providence from God, but it's not stated. It's not stated. So I think it's still just kind of hanging between the two of them. Probably, as far as push, she had a greater reason, but who was the more honorable? Don't know that I can answer that, So, as Esther is brought into the citadel, we hear a phrase that we've heard a couple times. Verse 9, the girl pleased him, Haggai, the chief eunuch of the harem, and won his favor. And this reminds us of who else? Who else won favor in a bad situation? Joseph. Remember? He was thrown into prison and won favor of the chief jailer. Daniel also won favor and was able to offer a compromise. We'll talk about his compromise a little bit later on. He offered a compromise for not eating the king's food, drinking his wine. But it's at this point that a wrench is thrown into the works, which leads us to a second question. verse 10 tells us that Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. So, why did Mordecai forbid this? Why did he forbid her? Why do you think? You know, he said, "Now don't tell them you're a Jew. Don't tell them you're from Jerusalem."
I think it's part of his plan for where it goes. I mean, that's just an example of how do you affect something that you don't agree with. Obviously, there's Jews kind of educated, and you know, I was thinking, how can you make a difference? Sometimes you got to get in the lines again. You know, if I may be sending her there, allowing that to happen, or have some influence, that would make a lot better for the Jews. You know?
Yeah, he didn't want her family, nationality, where she's from, Jerusalem, to be a stumbling block in the king's mind as to whether she's beautiful enough and smart enough to become my queen.
And once she's on the inside, once she's there, becomes part of it, she can exert some influence on her family or nationality.
Plus, she was an orphan, that could have been a blemish.
Yeah, that could have been too. Because this is a heathen group of people. They didn't look at things like believers see things. Any other ideas or thoughts? Why wasn't she, why did he tell her? Don't reveal your country. Don't reveal who you are. And I think it goes back to the anti-Semitic feeling that was already in government at the time. And Mordecai may very well have thought, you know, you might be able to exert an influence to kind of lessen this anti-Semitic feeling that is in government if you do become queen. But now, was this wrong? Some commentators will note that Mordecai was deceptive, and he was wrong to tell her not to do this. And some commentators will say this is why God's name is not in the book of Esther, because God was displeased with both Esther and Mordecai for just such things. And a question that comes up from this, and we'll probably explore it a little more in the next week because I'm about to eat my time up. Are there boundaries or guidelines for testimony? What is the distinction between being wise and bold or deceptive and fearful in witness?
Well, sometimes when you don't bring out the whole truth in the long run, it comes back and bites you in the hind end.
Okay. So,
By her not telling him that, you know, I see takes you do, and it gives her an in, but, you know, a lot of times when you deceive people, and then they find out later that you did that on purpose, then, you know, sometimes that has a bad reflection.
okay.
Those with me.
So, other thoughts?
Even to add to that, it could even hurt people that you're good up against too. Look at, for instance, Abraham and Sarah. I mean, you know, Abraham said, "This is my sister," and then when she went in to be with kings of the other tribe, and they were like, "Wait a minute, what did you do to us?"
Mhm.
I
Yeah,
mean,
it's because
this
he
can have reverse
had her life.
effects on both sides.
Yeah. Now, we have to clarify that Mordecai told Esther, don't tell her. We have to work under the assumption that she was never asked. Now, had she been asked, then certainly it would have been a lie. It would have been deceptive. But had evidently She was never asked. It was assumed on their part that she was one of the people of Persia living in Susa, the capital, the summer capital of Xerxes. And so it never came up. And he had women with all shades of color and skin color and location brought from these 127 provinces from Pakistan to Sudan today have been the area.
If you follow that line of thought though, because once you pick a line, you have to stick, if you follow that line of thought, if he's getting credit for bringing her and it's his niece, then you have to cross off number 2 that they knew he was Jewish. Because you can't, when you pick a line, it's just you have to follow, and so then you have to take his name out, because if they didn't know she was, they didn't know he was.
Yeah, I have all ideas that they did not know Mordecai was a Jew.
They would not have known.
Yeah.
And so that could not have been one of his reasons that he was worried about.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it could still be because, he was working a roundabout. Kind of a left-handed way of trying to reduce this.
Is that what you're looking for? Scheming?
Scheming, yeah.
Well, I think when you don't ask.
Put Naomi by it up here, yeah.
When you don't ask and you don't tell, then that's a scheming in a way too. I think, you say, well, he didn't ask me, so,
Yeah. So is it deceptive? And here's the discussion I think we'll spend probably, the next couple of minutes here and next week as well looking at. Are we being, and let's put it in this format, are we being sinfully deceptive if we don't tell it all, whether we're asked or not? Are we being sinfully deceptive?
I think it goes back to motive.
Tell me a little more about that.
Well, I mean, if he's not telling it all for the right reason, and whatever is in his heart, which you and I don't know. I mean, if you're not telling it all to protect somebody else, in my mind, that would be okay. But if you're not telling it all because you're embarrassed that you're a Jew, or, I don't know.
Yeah, and this is the question I think we need to wrestle with because it comes up here and it's part of the passage. So I think it's why we have to look at it.
Well, now we do this too, not to give poor Mordecai, right? And I see what Vicky's saying, because like, if somebody asks you a question, your answer, especially mine, could be like this big. But what you choose to answer them, for whatever reason, may only be
Maybe
this big.
yeah.
So see, but I do know, like, your motive, it would be more wrong if you're just gonna hurt that person's feelings, or you're gonna say something just to cause controversy, or just to cause a problem. And I think probably even as we get older, that happens. Like, when you're in your 20s, your answer's this big. Now, my answer's this big. Sometimes my answer's that big, depending on how little I want to argue with you. You know what I mean? So, is it wrong? You don't know.
And I think that's what we have to wrestle with on that, because coming with this, we have to go to the idea of witness. Are there boundaries? Are there guidelines of witness? Well, bless God, if you go in to be interviewed for a job, you need to tell them right then you're a conservative, Bible-believing Southern Baptist.
Yeah.
We need to do that. Republican, yeah, Tea Party, whatever.
This liberal world,
Yeah, just make it as hard on yourself as you possibly can.
Some people can
Survival, but to survive the situation,
Okay.
to me, you're gonna work it. You're gonna come down on you. You can say what you want, but you're gonna protect yourself in that situation. You're gonna get smaller and smaller.
Yeah, and the question is for us, is that wrong?
Well, some people could say that Jesus did the very same thing, though. He spoke in parables a lot, and those parables didn't necessarily pertain to everybody. They pertained to the few that he was handing them to anyway. So,
Good analogy.
And I'll give you when you're on another good example that makes sense. When you're on a mission trip, or when you're talking to your children, and one of these kids asks you a question, you're not going to answer that question out here. You're going to answer that question in here because of the influence you could have on that child's life. Because you don't have time to say did, you can't do it. Because then they're gonna look at it, and that's a great, I do that with my kids, I do that when I'm out, you do that all the time.
And I think it's good because it's easy to say that he was wrong in telling her not to do this. The first, knee jerk to this would be, well, no, he should have just told her and she should have just gotten in the king's face and said, I'm a Jew, what you going to do about it? And he'd have shown her what he was going to do about it at that point.
Well, I mean, look at the Holocaust and the Jews that had to hide, they would have been stupid if they would have went out, well, I'm a Jew, what you going to do about it? Because they know what they would have done about it.
We got a gas tank over here. I'll show you what we'll do about it. And I think, and I want you to ponder this when we come back next week and talk about it some more, because we will. Really looking at, what are the boundaries? What is wisdom? When you are living, you have to remember, and I know I'm past time here, so if you have to go. But when you're living in a foreign land, under an oppressive regime, what is smart? And what is bold witness? And we'll see both of these. We'll talk about Daniel next week. He had both of them. Both situations arise. And Jesus faced it. He balanced this out. And we'll talk about that. I think one of the biggest things, and I'll wrap it all up with this, is that, at least for today, is that the Bible wants us to be consistent in testimony. Be consistent. Wherever you are, try to be consistent in who you are in Jesus Christ. That's the bigger issue. And there are guidelines. There are some boundaries, I think, to what is the difference between bold and wise, or deceptive or fearful. I think there are some boundaries, and we'll talk about those. Good discussion. Grab you some coffee, grab you something to eat. Thank you for the discussion. We'll pick this up again next week.